What has Jesus called you to build? In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence. And the king said to me, "Why is your face sad, seeing you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of the heart." Then I was very much afraid. Here's Nehemiah, and he can't hide the fact that his heart is breaking for his people. His heart is breaking for his city. I really believe that in my journey of God calling me to be a part of Vintage Church, I can go back to a defining moment. It was a moment where God broke my heart. And that moment was in a setting similar to this. It was in my in-laws' home up in South Carolina. My wife and I had kind of fled from the threat of Hurricane Katrina. It was through Hurricane Katrina and me actually in this moment watching a TV screen that God placed a burden upon my life. And so what we're talking about is, what has Jesus called you to do? What has he put within you that is this passion, this burning fire within your soul that you have to do? We want to, as a church, embrace God's presence. And when you embrace God's presence, God wants to clearly reveal to you what it is that he's called you to build. And I pray that as we together embrace God's presence, that he would be clear in our lives as to the very things that he's called us to build. I said to the king, "Let the king live forever. Why should not my face be sad when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" Then the king said to me, "What are you requesting?" So I prayed to the God of heaven, and I said to the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it." And the king said to me, the queen sitting beside him, "How long will you be gone? And when will you return?" So it pleased the king to send me when I had given him a time. And I said to the king, "If it pleases the king, let letters be given me to the governors of the province beyond the river, that they may let me pass through until I come to Judah. And the letter of Asaph, and the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress of the temple, and for the wall of the city, and for the house that I shall occupy." And the king granted me what I asked, for the good hand of my God was upon me. Here, Nehemiah was the cupbearer to the king. And so God had given him some relationships that were going to give him not just the ability to get back to Jerusalem, but also connections with other people that were going to help give him the tools in order to rebuild the wall. That statement, "For the good hand of my God was upon me," is so real to the story of my journey here in New Orleans. We've been asking this question here today, and it's a simple question: what has Jesus called you to build? Well, as I shared with you, as I watched our city being devastated from Katrina, God used that moment to break my heart for the city, calling me and my wife to the city. And when God calls you to something, he's going to provide. In my story, as God confirmed that my wife and I were called back to New Orleans, I got a phone call to be a part of an organization called Mission Lab in the city. And spending some years being a part of the rebuilding, connecting with faith-based organizations that also came into our city to rebuild homes, rebuild churches. The Lord also led me and my brother to start a young adult ministry called Him and I. We had a blast doing that. And those jobs, those different opportunities were part of God's confirmation of His call upon my life to be a part of building what He wanted me to build here in New Orleans. So I went to Jerusalem and was there 3 days. Then I arose in the night, I and a few men with me. And I told no one what my God had put into my heart to do for Jerusalem. There was no animal with me, but the one on which I rode. I went by night by the valley gate to the dragon spring and to the dung gate. And I inspected the walls of Jerusalem that were broken down and its gates that had been destroyed by fire. Then I went on to the fountain gate and to the king's pool, but there was no room for the animal that was under me to pass. Then I went up in the night by the valley and inspected the wall, and I turned back and entered by the valley gate, and so returned. And the officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing. And I had not yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, and the rest who were to do the work. Then I said to them, "You see the trouble we are in, how Jerusalem lies in ruins with its gates burned. Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer suffer derision." And I told them of the hand of my God that had been upon me for good, and also of the words that the king had spoken to me. And they said, "Let us rise up and build." So they strengthened their hands for the good work. In this passage, Nehemiah rallies the people, and he says, "Let us rise up and build." One of the beautiful parts of this story is not just as Nehemiah is called by God, not just as Nehemiah steps and starts walking in God's provision, with the king giving him permission, providing resources, but it's also when he gets on the ground in Jerusalem. And when my wife and I came back to New Orleans post-Katrina, started to roll up our sleeves, starting to serve the city, God began to give us clarity as to the very specific thing that God was calling us to build in the city. We've been asking this question: what has Jesus called you to build? And I believe that we have a general calling. All of us are called to go and make disciples of all nations. Everyone who's part of the church is called to live the gospel, love the city, be the church. But we also receive specific callings. Some of us to be students, to be teachers, to be business owners, to be moms, to be dads, to be athletes. And all of us are together on that same mission. The mission that God called me to build is this church called Vintage Church. And in the fall of 2008, Jesus called my wife and I and a small group of people here in New Orleans to start a brand new church. That happened, honestly, my wife had a relationship with some of her co-workers. She was a massage therapist on Magazine Street, and through some amazing things where we were able to share the gospel, see people saved by the gospel, God called us to start this church. Man, there's been so many different confirmations throughout the years. God's grace has been evident every step of the way. And although it's not always been easy, we're going to read in the book of Nehemiah, this story was not easy. God has continued to sustain his calling of what he called us to build here in the city of New Orleans. God has moved in such a way that he alone receives all glory and praise for Vintage Church. I'm so thankful for what he's done over the years, and I know we're going to rise up together and continue to be faithful to what he's called us to do in the future.